have Kerry Rounders, who is a very successful consultant, governance professional, also teaches sometimes on the programme. So we've been very pleased to have a long-running collaboration with Kerry. But today she's going to talk to us about whistleblowing. Very important. Lots of you will, I think, see how important that is, and you might see some relevance with things that you see in the media. I always think the post office is a prime example of where whistleblowing, had it been effective, might have been made it a lot less of a drama than it is now. So I'm going to hand over to Kerry. I'm not going to tell you too much about her past in case it spoils her slides. I'm hoping none of the dark stuff is on the slides. And so if Kerry wants to talk, or if you've got questions about Kerry's governance career, do please ask later on. I'm sure she'll be happy to share. Kerry, let me know if you want me to do anything with your slides.
I think we'll muddle on through. Now, firstly, there's some people that have joined us online, so welcome to you as well. I can't actually see you unless I actively go into the system, but I understand that if you want to speak or if you've got any questions, Charlie, are you going to be sort of keeping an eye on that and letting us know if people have got questions?
I can, yeah, I can do if you want me to.
That might be helpful if you put something in the chat, and then Charlie, you can. So,
and I can monitor that as well.
Yeah, so welcome, everyone's welcome. And I just, before I go on to who I am, I just asked who was a student, who was a non-student. Students who are really important. I'm really delighted to see you all here, but I'm also intrigued as to the non-students and why you're here and what you're hoping to get out today. So there's only 3 of you in the room. Would you mind if I asked each of you to give me a little bit of what you're here for?
Yeah, I'm a lecturer in accountancy and finance. It basically teaches financial accounting. That's nice to hear, to be honest. But I have taught last year corporate governance, so I'm really interested into this, subject. And my research interests are basically around corporate governance and sustainability. So that is why I'm here to have, some insight into one of the professionals. So yeah, that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
I'm a technician in the School of Engineering.
My husband's an engineer, I'm delighted to see you here.
But I'm also interested in legal matters, like you've already mentioned, the post office scandal, human rights, and supporting. I have a part-time job supporting vulnerable people in custody. So from a whistleblowing, thinking about the affected people in workplace situations.
Yeah.
That's of interest to me.
My name is Foster. I work in the international office. I'm an accounting.
What office, sorry?
International office, accounting technician. I'm here to just have an overview of how governance work in the industry.
Excellent. And then of my students over here, who's governance students? I'm recognising you all at the back. So the guys on the front row, I'm going to guess, are you finance? Anyone finance?
No, we're all doing sustainability.
Exciting. Everyone's all on the same course, so 2 different courses.
Enoch teaches both modules.
I see.
So they are taking my governance and risk module on MSc sustainability, and so I thought this would be very good for them.
Yeah, well, yes. I'll tell you why I hesitated about that in a second. And so today this forum is for you. So whistleblowing is the bulk of what, the stuff that I prepared diligently way into the night. But equally, I am a governance professional. So if there are any specific questions or that you have, then use this as a safe space. Do we use Chatham House rules in here? What we talk about in here stays in here. Although I think it was recorded, so I'm not sure about that. So was there anyone that was brave enough to kind of speak out? Was there anything that you specifically wanted to get from today? And I'll make sure in the next 90 we do.
I wanted to ask around the practice of whistleblowing and also how the governance process can support that level of transparency of decision making, so that actually the level of whistleblowing can be reduced, or the need for it, because there's a greater transparency through the governance processes and structures.
Entirely is the answer, but yeah, I will cover that a lot. Anything else? But as we go along through the session, then feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll do a bit of an intro before I launch straight into. Well, that's awful at that height. Funnily enough, the first time I came into this lecture hall, I'm not even sure if you were there, Nikki. It was the first ever branch of the East Midlands branch of the CGI. Is anyone else CGI branch member? Yeah. I think I was pregnant. At that stage, I was the Deputy Company Secretary at Next PLC. I'd moved up from London about a year before that, maybe 2 years before that. I'd been based in London for 20 odd years. I know it's hard to believe. As up to a Deputy Co-Sec, I've never actually been in a Co-Sec, although most Deputy Co-Secs will tell you that they do all of the work of the Co-Sec and take none of the salary home with them. Although that's changing. If anyone wants to look at the salary guide for company secretaries, it's like through the roof at the moment. So yes, I have worked in-house, mainly for listed companies, AIM-listed, standard-listed, large private companies. You may have heard of Westfield Shopping Towns. In London, they did buy Nottingham and they bought Birmingham, but when things crashed out and pear-shaped. So I did that for my in-house career. I started off thinking I was going to be a human rights lawyer, actually, and save the world, and then I realised I just cried at everything, so I didn't have the right personality for that, and I came into the company law sphere. So after I had my little boy, I realised that going back into an in-house wasn't going to work, so I set up my consultancy. That was 6 years ago. I've got 5 employees now. We go into all sorts of organisations, from not-for-profits, including RNLI. I was the company secretary there for a time whilst they were finding a replacement. Direct Line you might have heard of. Lots of companies you will have heard of, and I'm sure lots of other ones that you won't have heard of. I wrote the whistleblowing policy and procedures for Ocado, which I'm sure everybody has heard about. And a lot of my slides that I prepared today are the training slides that I used for them. So if I missed an Ocado out on the slides, then that's why. So before we start talking about whistleblowing, and I think most people here understand what governance is, Nikki has got her own analogies, ships we were talking about earlier. I struggle to explain what it is that I do to pretty much everybody, including my children. And if anyone's got a neat way of explaining what they think governance is, then perhaps they can share it with us. Anybody got any astute thoughts on what governance actually is? All too shy. So the way I describe it, and the ship analogy that Nikki uses, I'm sure you're familiar with. You're guiding the ship, and this ship has it's a strategy. Where's the ship going is the strategy. How is it getting there? That's the governance framework, the processes. How are we doing this, but how are we doing it within the confines of the legislation, the regulation, and the best practice? I'm only really interested, and for those of you that I've taught, I have a whiteboard. I'm interested in the board, the directors, and the shareholders, and then everything below that tends to fall into a different category, like your HR department, for example. But things that affect the board, the decision making that the board should be doing, and the things that I'm interested in. Whistleblowing is interesting to me because it's specifically one of the policies that a board of directors should be aware of. You think of all of those of you that work, hands up who work. I don't mean that patronisingly to the younger ones. So in your organisation, how many policies do you think you have?
110.
Not bad. Anyone raise 110? You've got a lot, right? Most of those, I mean, at university, I bet you've got 1,000.
Yeah.
How
How many?
Yeah, most of them, is it Board of Trustees?
Yes, Board of Governors,
Board
yeah.
of Governors wouldn't be remotely interested in, and it'd be wasting their time to take those policies and processes to them. But whistleblowing is one of the ones that specifically the board should be aware of and should be aware of every single report that's been made to them. Let me just remind myself what's next on my slides. So this is a bit about what today's session is all about. So today I'm going to talk about popular culture. We're going to talk about what whistleblowing is. We're going to look a bit of current affairs. I might swap that around a bit. We're going to talk about why it's important to protect whistleblowers, and then we're going to go into the legislative background, which will cover all of your questions on governance and protecting whistleblowers. Before we start talking about movies, has anybody got any experience? I mean, don't give me details and names and things, but has anyone got any direct experience with whistleblowing?
I suppose that when I was in my previous organisation, I used to manage what was called the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian.
Yeah, I just learned about those.
Yeah, so that's the whole, obviously following Lucy Letby, that's a whole thing now that needs to be enhanced and be a bit bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, has anybody heard of those before? What are they called? NHS Speak Up? No,
Freedom to
Speak Up
Guardians, yeah.
Freedom to Speak Up Guardians. Anybody got any other experience of whistleblowing outside of work? Have you thought about it before? Has it ever come up? Have you read anything about it? Have you watched Erin Brockovich?
Yeah.
Any other movies that you think whistleblowing?
There was one with Matt Damon.
Matt Damon, The Informer.
Yeah,
or The Informant, yeah. Any others?
Big Short.
Yeah, Big Short,
I
yeah.
get my students to watch that for one of our sessions, and I can't think which one it is now. Is that more insider dealing?
Yeah, but there was a whistleblower. There were people talking about
There
it.
should have been.
Yeah.
Anything else that you might have seen on telly recently? There's so many. Has anybody watched Berlin Station? There's one recently with Michelle. What was in Coronation Street, married to Mark Wright.
Oh, yeah, the
Fool Me
Once with Joanna Lumley and
she's brilliant in it. Has anyone seen that? All whistleblowing.
all this homework you can do in front of
Yeah.
Netflix.
This is why my students like me as a teacher, because I get you to watch films. But my point being, I might have done some pictures here actually. I haven't seen this film. Anyone recognise Come Back Here?
Yeah.
There's so much in our everyday life that you probably wouldn't have ever thought, oh, that's whistleblowing. Like it's so prevalent. Edward Snowden, the most famous whistleblower of the 2010s. I don't really know anything about that. Has anyone seen this?
I've seen that movie.
Good movie.
It's all right.
I have written some notes on some of these ones. I won't go through. I won't go through that one. Erin Brockovich. This is the one, The Informant. With
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
There's a link here I can share with you on movies that have got whistleblowing in. But I just wanted to kind of give you that feel for. Actually, this might feel like something that's just a policy on your company website, but actually, it's really ingrained in a lot of areas of our lives that we perhaps wouldn't have thought about. And the fact that we've got Hollywood blockbuster films and, I did go through a list of all of the dramas that are based on whistleblowing, like just TV dramas. And this, the post office scandal being the one that's really brought this to the fore, I think is quite significant. Okay. So what is whistleblowing? Anybody want to be bold enough to give me any thoughts on what whistleblowing actually is? Everyone's a bit shy. I need to warm you up first. So whistleblowing is the disclosure of information. Someone had their hands up there and I got a bit excited. Were you just tossing your hair?
Yeah, just.
So, without getting my lawyer hat on, whistleblowing is these are the important words. Disclosure of information which relates to suspected wrongdoing or malpractice connected to an organisation. And this is where people get their knickers in a twist and get it wrong. A lot of things are not whistleblowing. So, for example, somebody has been, you two, after the session, you come to Nikki and say the lady next to you has stolen your purse out of your handbag and you want to report that crime. Is that whistleblowing? It's not whistleblowing. If the dean had been caught shoplifting 5 times, would that be deemed as whistleblowing? If the shopkeeper reported, I should have thought of this before I started talking. No, bear with me. So you've got the dean of the university shoplifting, and you've got the shop owner reporting those thefts to, can't be not the police, back to somebody at the university.
There's a vice chancellor or somebody. If we could reach
Yeah,
that.
to the vice chancellor.
Yeah.
Is that whistleblowing? I'm kind of leading you here. I think
it's not
no.
Whistleblowing. It would, the person you would expect the employee to act and send to HR. If then HR didn't respond in an appropriate way because it's a legal matter, which would be you would expect a accusation of a crime to be reported to the police and for the appropriate authorities to investigate.
Yeah.
If the university do not follow up appropriately and then someone found out and then said that's wrong, that I would think be.
But in my belief, it's that person's personal life rather than that's connected to the organization.
They've got a legal, the university will have a professional legal requirement to act upon potentially, information about illegal activity by one of their employees.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, so what I threw in there specifically was shopkeeper. So the shopkeeper, it's not whistleblowing because it's not his organisation. So we've got rid of that one. So multiple choice, that's not whistleblowing. But if we tailored that down again, so the dean was, and by shoplifting, it could be shoplifting, it could be some creative accounting. Let's think that I actually worked for PwC once at the start of my career, and just before I joined, somebody had been compromised off actually because they had created a fake recruitment agency and they had been approving the invoices for temporary workers, and it was a fake agency and fake workers, and they were receiving the money themselves. So there's these, so the shoplifting, it was an easy example of something off the shelf, but it could easily be some kind of financial crime, and it's the dean that I've mentioned here specifically. So if somebody within the organisation was aware that that was happening, is that a whistleblowing, is my question. I think so, but because it's the dean, and you would expect that person, you said code of conduct, so you would expect a person of that level to hold themselves to a high standard. If it was, no offence, one student reporting another student about theft, you don't expect your students to shoplift, but your levels of expectations are slightly different depending on who it is in the organisation. I mean, I didn't plan these examples out before I came here, but my point being it's very nuanced, and it can be very tricky for people to understand what whistleblowing actually is, and that's why a lot of people get it wrong. So let's do a little bit more of the science behind it. So here we've got disclosure of information relating to a suspected wrongdoing, and we'll go through what wrongdoing means shortly. Connected to an organisation, so it's this specific organisation. Personal grievances and complaints not covered. Go to HR, go to your people department, not covered. Or shouldn't be interested. But when making a report, consider whether you are acting as a public interest, and that's why I brought the dean in. Would the public be interested that the dean had been caught up a number of times? Arguably, yes. it's not black and white. But these are key things to remember when we're looking at what whistleblowing is or whistleblowing isn't. A lot of people don't get this right. People in HR departments don't get this right, which is why in the end what people tend to do is put everything in the banner of whistleblowing just because they want to cover themselves. They don't get it wrong. So what could this be? So if we go back to the suspected wrongdoing or malpractice, could be criminal activity, but in a really bad example I gave, we can see that it's not always. Could be actions that breach an organisation's existing policies, but again, it has to have that public interest element to it as well. So a breach of policy is by itself isn't going to be something you can whistleblowing. Similar to failure to comply with a legal or regulatory obligation, miscarriage of justice, endanger of individuals' health and safety, damage to the environment. Now, these have all come from a piece of legislation that I'll talk through shortly. But it's all a bit wishy-washy. There's no defined list here. Everyone wants a list that's got something on. You can go through it and tick and go, yeah, that's definitely something but there isn't. There's got to be an element of kind of science added to it. I thought I'd break it up by talking about some actual cases that are going on either at the moment or recently. We've already talked about Lucy Leppy. Do you want to talk a little bit more to the room about that case? Put you on the spot?
So for those that have
Does everyone know that you're NHS, aren't you? Yeah. Or used to be? Right, yeah.
So Lucy Leppy was a neonatal nurse who killed quite a few babies and attempted to kill another load of babies, and on numerous occasions staff that she worked with whistleblew, went to senior managers to say, we think this nurse is doing these things, and they were quashed. They were not believed and actually put themselves at point of being dismissed or fired basically for saying these things. So the public inquiry that's going on subsequently is looking at what was wrong with that whistleblowing policy, that actually all of those systems and processes in place that should have said when somebody says something we'll investigate actually shut people down. So they were enrolled for so many more months and so many more deaths because nobody was listening to the people that actually
and it went further than that, because when the doctors and nurses that Lucy Leppy worked with, and I've got down that it was 7 babies, well this is what's known, isn't it, murder of 7 babies and attempted murder of 6 other babies at Chester Hospital. It went even further that she then raised a grievance. A grievance is a HR matter, a grievance isn't whistleblowing, and those doctors and nurses were asked to apologise to her. So there was a huge systemic issue there, and that's when I read about the freedom to speak up guardians. I've not seen that work in practice. Do you know how that works in practice?
It has it can be superficially, yes, we tick the box and we've got that. The definition of freedom to speak up now is around it used to be anything to do with patient care, and that followed from mid-staffs. But it's now anything and everything that can come. So where you talked about an internal HR process, somebody could go to the freedom to speak up guardian if they weren't getting resolution through the normal processes, and then they'd look to see is there a trend on this ward or in this team that means actually there's a bullying culture and that's ultimately going to impact on patient care at some point. So it kind of looks at everything, but whether or not it actually resolves the issues that go to them, I couldn't comment.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to come back to that. I want to plow on with a little bit more with the technical stuff, and then we'll come back to some more examples. So here's my question. So what is whistleblowing? Whistleblowing is the act of making this disclosure. That's what whistleblowing is. Making this disclosure, and it can only be deemed to be whistleblowing is if it's those things, the wrongdoing, within that organisation that's in the public interest. So that's what whistleblowing is, and a whistleblower is therefore the person that makes that whistleblowing disclosure. So I think that's quite clear. We can all, grapple. Clear is that wrongdoing. What do we mean by wrongdoing? And I can't give you an answer to that today, but that's where we have to put a bit of our cognitive abilities in place to kind of work it through. And that's why the governance framework behind it should be such that it allows us and educates us to be able to make that decision. And ultimately the buck has got to stop with someone within an organisation on that. So, but why is it important, do you think, that we protect, should we protect whistleblowers? Probably, because I grew up with a really negative view of whistleblowers. It was just something like, I don't know where that came from, at all, but any views? Sorry, you're nodding over there. Should we protect whistleblowers was my question. No, you're different. Sorry, I haven't asked names, I'm rubbish at names.
Yes, if it's understood, believe that the information was disclosed in good faith, with for decent reasons, and they're passing the information on for something to be looked into, from professional people to look into it, then I think they shouldn't have any comeback. It's not fair on them, but also it can impede on future disclosures. If the word gets out that nothing gets done, or there's an impact on the person, there's victimisation or what have you, then it's going to just stop those things happening, things being looked into in the future.
Yeah. Any other views?
Yeah, I had a very similar experience with, I think when I taught the corporate governance module, a lot of my international students, they had working experience, and they gave me like such alarming examples, because they come from developing countries, and they said there are serious retaliation against people who whistleblow in those countries. So it's quite alarming. Like nobody will come up if somebody's got retaliated against.
So in this country, our law allows for anonymous reports to be made. But that's not the same internationally. When we put this together for Ocado, I can't remember now, but I think you can anonymous in this country, but not in, it's either Spain or France. I can't remember. But you can't have one side. Think about. Sorry, my experience is very much focused on listed companies, so I tend to talk about those a lot. But imagine an international company. Having one whistleblowing policy and one whistleblowing set of processes isn't going to cut it, because of this very point about having anonymous. Can you think of any practical implication then of having anonymous whistleblowing?
Evidence.
In what way?
You could be potentially losing a witness.
Yeah.
Witness statements, because if the whistleblower wants to remain anonymous, which is reasonable in some situations, then some people, the amount of evidence to be provided will be limited.
Absolutely.
Could be limited.
Absolutely. The options for investigation are limited, because you're limited to the information that you're given. But take a step back. Look, put yourself in you're a co-sec assistant, and you're devising a whistleblowing policy, and you've got to make sure that you've got an opportunity for anonymous reports to be made. Practically, how are you going to do that? In this day and age, how do we make an anonymous report? It's not a trick question. Can you provide an email address? No, it's got to be anonymous. So what's your alternatives? No email address, generally no. I think there's telephone could be anonymous, but often telephone can put people off because it's a two-way conversation, and you might not be able to keep your anonymity if your voice can be heard.
I think that's where in the NHS the freedom to speak up guardians come in, because they're the only people that know who have made that.
But that's not anonymous. If one person knows, it's not anonymous.
But also going to the regulators.
Make a complaint box or something, go to old age, and where people could put
hard copy.
Yeah.
hard copy, having a box on the CFO's office, like literally
And that could be
the only option, unless, and there's a big industry out there, for people setting up whistleblowing hotlines, and now we have whistleblowing websites. So you, in theory, they can capture your report as a third party. But that in itself, you know, when we looked at Ocado, I think the resource we were looking at was something like £20,000 per year. Well, that's prohibitive for a lot of organisations to do that. So practically, for our law allowing anonymous reports to be made, anonymous has to be anonymous. So we have to make sure that we've got the opportunity for that. So if you've got hard copy reports, so imagine you work for Heinz, for example, and you've seen somebody's been slighted because they've been looked over for a promotion, and that's the person that puts the special sauce in Heinz baked beans. Do you like my examples I'm coming up with? So somebody puts the special 7 spices into the Heinz baked beans, and they've now decided, because they're the ones that do it, to put 12 spices in, or they're putting poison in, or they're putting something else in, and it's 10 to 5, and the CFO who's got the box on his desk that you can make the reports into, as long as it's not on his desk, it's got to be somewhere that, you know, no one's going to see. You go home at 5 o'clock and you've got a hard copy whistleblowing report about poison that's gone into baked beans at 10 to 5, and nobody's going to look at that box until Monday morning. By which time, how many thousands, I've watched Inside the Factory recently, so I should remember how many thousands and thousands and thousands of tins of baked beans have gone out internationally across the world that have got this poison, this toxic ingredient inside. The whistleblower has, so they've seen a wrongdoing, let's strip that back. They've made an anonymous report. They've seen about a wrongdoing. That is one of those things, you know, that list that I had, and it had, you know, health and safety or harmed people, and it's in the public interest. So all of those things apply. So we know we've got a whistleblower, they've made the report, but still nothing's being done about it till Monday morning, and all the damage that can be done between that time. So it's the COSEC, often it's in HR, but I think it's the wrong place to be in HR, is responsible for making sure that you've got that process in place. That means we don't have a box on a desk that's not looked at for hours. There has got to be a process in place, and that's got to trigger, and that's got to cover when people are on holiday. And what I do see in practice, probably should say I've never seen anything exciting in real life that's whistleblowing. Occasionally you see secret squirrels and people get all excited that there's been a whistleblowing report. Generally, I'd say if a company gets 30 or 40 whistleblowing reports a year, probably maybe 1 or 2 are actual whistleblowing reports. Most of them aren't. They're HR grievances. They're not actual whistleblowing reports at all. But it's the COSEC that has to think, okay, this is our process, this is our policy, but actually we've got this telephone call escalation in place so that if something happens after 5 o'clock, then the telephone call is triggered and somebody is called and somebody's called. Well, actually, they left the company 5 years ago, so our telephone tree ends at the second person, so it's not going to work. So practically, there's a lot for the company secretary team to unpick, and that's what your governance is. It's all of those things to make sure that slide that I started off with, that 1-2 lines, what is whistleblowing, that itself then turns into this framework that really does work. And I don't have all of the answers, and I certainly wouldn't want to be at the NHS trying to deal with that problem.
Sorry, it's just a random question because I don't really know anything about this subject so much, but if I saw someone putting poison, like as an example, poison, am I not legally obliged to go to the police?
Not legally obliged.
Like if it's poison and you know that it's going to then end up in people's mouths.
Now why might that person not? Okay, let's go with the.
When do I call the police and when do I just?
So I think so that maybe comes to morality and ethics as well. But let's take the poison out of it then, and maybe it's the 12 spices instead of 7 spices, or it's got something else in it that's not going to kill people, but they're not going to like the taste as much.
Laxatives.
Laxatives. I think that's a really interesting point, and let's pop a pin in it.
Because all of this is like criminal in a way.
Yeah, but you could walk past somebody in the street that's beaten somebody else up, and you're not. I think, does anyone else know? Do you know, Nikki? You're not obliged to report a crime if you. The fear of victimisation, for whatever reason that might be, is why we in this country give our whistleblowers that anonymity. But I think we're in the minority. I don't know the data, but globally, I think more often it has to be non-anonymous, has to be named rather than anonymous. You're quite right. If we're putting poison in beans, please everybody report it to the police. I haven't finished my technical bit yet, so we'll come on to another bit that will cover. All right.
Yes, it had muted, but it should be unmuted now.
Oh. So we've had people on call for all this time, and I'm not.
No, it's only for a few seconds. No, I just got a message saying it's muted, so I unmuted it.
So I'm mindful of time, but I think the discussion is really interesting. So why is the protection of whistleblowers important was the question I asked. To internal control of risks, to avoid unnecessary litigation, to limit the reputational damage, to protect staff morale, to avoid criminal liability are just a few of the other things. And that you can tell my brain is thinking about protecting the organisation. You know, why for a company are they motivated to make sure they've got the appropriate processes in place? Why as an organisation are they motivated? But I've got my mind on I'd love to drill down into the Lucy Letby a bit more, but, you know, I can't help feeling that trying to silence everybody was their way of doing all of these things, rather than dealing with it in order to, you know, if they'd have dealt with it when it happened, all of these things have now happened and it's all terrible. Does anybody here remember Beverly Allen? Yeah, my cousin used to share a house with her when they were trainee nurses. But for me, and those of us of a certain age, it's just so similar. It's just so similar. And there must have been things put in place from the Beverly Allen case that allowed people or enabled the doctors and nurses to make these reports about Lucy Letby. But that system was let down by the investigation stage of it, perhaps. Again, I don't know. I've only read what I've seen in the press. What is whistleblower? Current law. When a worker, and there's a whole definition that we don't need to go into today about, you know, when you've got contractors versus employment contracts. But a worker discloses wrongdoing within their organisation, often called making a disclosure or blowing the whistle, formally known as making a disclosure in the public interest. And I think, even though it comes from the Public Interest Act, or PIDA, I think it's that public interest that most people don't even think about when they think about whistleblowing. I think that's the crux, whether it's in the public interest or not, helps you make that decision because somebody's deciding. Is it like me to say something? No. Whether it's whistleblowing or not. So the Public Interest Disclosure Act was 1998. I bet some of you were born after 1998, were you? Yeah. Oh man. Public interest disclosure. Protect workers from accidental treatment or victimisation of their employer if, in the public interest, they blow the whistle on. I mean, that's not. So, to my delight, but also horror, I realised very recently that there is a whistleblowing bill 2024 that's coming in. I know very little about this yet. And the reason I know very little about this is in my line of work, there's a lot of things that the government promises are coming, and you have to read thousands of pages to get up to speed with what they are, and then they just suspend them and they don't come. So I make a practice of making sure it's only when it's in, do I really know the details of it. But the Public Interest Disclosure Act has come under scrutiny for inadequacies to protect whistleblowers, and therefore, and I think probably from the post office scandal, that's really brought this whistleblowing bill. You're nodding a lot. Do you know anything about the bill? Do you want to teach
I know
us?
a little bit about the post office, and I was talking with Nikki about how they were going to have to bring something in because it's all.
Oh, fab. Well, you know what? That's a good moment. Let's talk about a little bit about the post office. What do you know about the post office scandal?
Not an awful lot. It's been a little while since I've looked into it, I have to admit. But I know that it all went wrong because the postmasters started to be charged money that they weren't losing. And so they lost their post office and everything. And there's a lot of criminal action against them. People died from suicide or it's taken that long. It's terrible. I think there's only something like 90 people have come out of it.
3 have had their convictions.
So, yeah.
Overturned, yeah.
There's like 900 plus people that are affected, isn't it? So I was looking at it this morning, but a lot's changed this morning, but I don't know what's happened.
No, anyone else got some background on the post office scandal? Anyone seen the drama? Is it out yet? You've seen it? Yeah, is it any good?
Yeah.
Yeah, I best add it to my list. And is it factual? Is it quite factually correct, Nikki? Do you want to?
Yeah, I believe it's quite factually correct. I've also watched the Panorama documentary, which is very good. But it's also, the post office was something I'd been aware of for several years, and it was one of those that you always thought, I've not seen it in the newspaper for a while, I'm sure they must have resolved it by now.
Yeah.
And then you find out that actually people are still saying, hang on a minute, there's a problem here. And the post office are not doing anything. I did actually look on the post office corporate website to see what they said about their whistleblowing policy. And there was a very nice generic, we have a robust whistleblowing policy and we are committed to investigating all instances of whistleblowing. You think, well, how come these people who started complaining in 1999, just after the PIDA came in, started saying there's a problem?
Yeah.
What were they actually doing?
Yeah, and when I love to get my students to look at the press and go, what's happening today? Because honestly, if I'm a little bit bored, if my LinkedIn profile is looking a little bit like I haven't engaged and you need it for algorithms, I literally look at the BBC website and every single day I can find an example of governance that you wouldn't think necessarily, oh, that's governance, but everything we do has a leg in governance, I really believe. With this post office scandal, and I was trying to look what date it was, Nikki, it goes back to 1999. People are aware of the post office scandal because I think we haven't heard the last of it yet. I think it's pretty huge. So it was with a company, is it Fujitsu?
Yeah.
Aren't they the camera people?
Yeah.
And it was something, there was an error. It's now come out all these years later that there was an error with the computer systems, which basically looked like the postmasters had been, their tills were short. Their tills were short. And over the last 20 odd years, however long it's been, there's been over 700 convictions. We've had, as you said, suicides. People have had to sell their houses to pay for this shortfall. And when you listen on the radio or when you see actual case studies of these people, there's a lot of the devastation is huge. And I don't want to be wrong when I tell you this. People were sent to jail. had to sell family jewels, had to sell houses. Now this guy, Richard Poll, who was the Panorama whistleblower, he didn't whistleblow to, there was a point to this, he didn't whistleblow to the organisation, he whistleblew to the press, which is allowed. I might have a slide of it, I'm not sure.
Computer Weekly.
Was it?
Yeah. Computer Weekly have done it for a long time, as have Private Eye have followed it over the years a lot. But, yeah,
but under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, you are allowed to make a whistleblowing report to your organisation or to a number of external agencies, which includes the police and the press. So all of these, and that is important because the protection that you get as a whistleblower is under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and therefore you are only protected if you act in accordance with that act, which is if you're making the report to the organisation or any of these list of external parties. So this Richard dude, he disclosed to the press, but then you go down complete rabbit warrants with this. The BBC had loads of injunctions against it. Apparently they had the Panorama show lined up for a long, long time, but couldn't actually put it out there because of all of these injunctions against it. So it's been a huge battle, which is why I feel like we've not heard the end of this yet. I think there's a lot going on. Nikki, you look like you were going to say something.
If I have, it's gone already in my goldfish type brain.
So you're quite right. I had 93, since legal proceedings, only 93 of these people have had their convictions quashed. And I think what's also interesting is the ethnicity of a lot of the postmasters as well, and the implications culturally from the shame and the lots and lots of other issues are going to come out of this. I think not just the whistleblowing, but it's fascinating, and I think that's then driven this bill to come through, and I think it's like the quickest bill they've put together, and it's one that they actually, I think we'll have it this year. I think we've got the draft act, so we'll get it this year. And I just wonder how many COSECs and HR departments have got that on their radar.
I think another interesting thing, if I can add, about the post office is the stakeholder map, because the post office is owned entirely by, all the shares are owned by the Secretary of State, the government. So you've got a very powerful stakeholder there, and you've got very powerful community in that it's the biggest franchise in Europe. So thousands, I think there's 12,000 post office branches, all supplying the community who all feel it's their post office. And so I think that the sub postmasters are quite a squeezed stakeholder in the middle of this very powerful owner and a very powerful community, that sometimes whistleblowing, it's all about, the company have to think about treating everyone fairly rather than, we'll not worry about the sub postmasters because we don't want to get into trouble with Secretary of State or something like that.
I think that's a really valid point. I've written that stakeholder map down, and I think the stakeholder, I said at the top of this that I'm interested in the board and the board's decision making and strategy, but I always say that I overlap that with the section 172, which is the legal duty on directors to treat, I forget the exact wording, consider all of their stakeholders and the impacts on them when making their decisions. So you're absolutely right to overlay that and the policies and the process behind it. And I keep looking at Becky because that goes to her question at the beginning about the governance to this, but it's all very well having a policy, but if you don't have the process in place, and it's all very well having the policy and the process, if it's just a document that's on your shared drive and that it's not living and breathing. But I'll come on to that in a little while. So be aware there is a new bill, and be aware there will be changes and people will panic, and so they'll write things really quickly, and whether they'll be effective. Have I done anything to the...
No, it's still good, and
So So the protection for whistleblower bill, PWB, will make it an offence to retaliate against whistleblowers, fail to act on their disclosures or cover up wrongdoing. So that's quite important. The fail to act on their disclosures will be the Lucy Letby, and all of these other ones, I imagine, or cover up wrongdoing. I mean, you'd like to think that wasn't allowed anyway. Central to the proposed legislation is the establishment of the Office of the Whistleblower, endowed with statutory powers to enforce fines and penalties against organisations and individuals responsible for retaliation or wrongdoing. So straight away, I'm thinking that sounds fabbo, but I'm thinking Information Commissioner and Data Protection. Anyone got any awareness of those? So I kind of think it would probably work in a similar. The Information Commissioner is this body set up by the government, must be, and all companies that process personal data have to register with the Information Commissioner. So you've got a form and a fee every year. I think it's only like £35 or something. And if anyone has any suspicions that personal data isn't being treated right, they can make a report to the Information Commissioner. Bear with me, I'm just trying to think that would be a way I think that this could be policed. But then I'm thinking practically, how is this going to be done? Where's the budget coming from to set up this national office of the whistleblower? And what additional processes and compliance will organisations have to do in order to make sure that they do this? So again, I haven't seen it myself and haven't seen the guidance, but it's interesting to know this is coming. But practically, as a company secretary, I'm now thinking of my stakeholders, but not my external stakeholders, all of my internal stakeholders. Who do I need to? I mean, I've got 1 or 2 clients, so I'm going to have to think about who all of their internal stakeholders will be. So their HR teams, might be their finance teams, might be their COSEC team, might be their legal team. To think who owns the policies, the processes, and what else to expect coming down the line. So it is interesting, but also you can see practically, this is how people might think, how can you make a career out of governance? But this is what my career is. No current timeline for this bill, but I've read some things that's very optimistic that it's going to come in. And I think that's entirely because of the post office drama bringing this to the fore. So we go back to what's actually law at the moment. So under EDA, protection is given to a whistleblower if their disclosure is one of the following relevant failures. Do you know what I mean by protection? Protection to the whistleblower, or hazard a guess at what I mean by that?
Protection from the hate and maybe for his job or her job.
Yeah, I'd love to say protection from the hate. I just don't know how to police that. But yes, they shouldn't be then victimised because of it. They shouldn't be exposed to name calling or other detriment. But big voice is their job. But they can. You are right. Hate. They should, if they're being put in a vulnerable position, then the organisation should move them or move the other person, but then it then goes into a bit of a spiral of grievances against other people. But yeah. So protection is given to a whistleblower if their disclosure is one of the following relevant failures. So that's what we talked about earlier, the wrongdoing, relevant failures, so criminal offence, breach of a legal obligation, miscarriage of justice, danger to health and safety of the individual, damage to the environment, deliberate concealment of information, tending to any of the above 5 matters. Protected disclosures are also covered in the Employment Rights Act. The reason I popped the legislation up there, does anyone remember what year I said it was? 96 for this one. So it's about time we had a more modern legislation. And I bet you the whistleblower bill doesn't cover any of the digital technology that we've got now. I'm intrigued as to whether it would. Oh. Yeah, we're good.
We're good, don't worry.
Great. So it's a protected disclosure. So a whistleblower disclosure is protected if the worker, so we go back to our shop owner reporting, not a worker, straight away, easy one. I'm now picturing a flow chart on what it's going to look like to make the journey as easy as possible and therefore the governance as easy as possible. I'm smiling, but I mean this, you know, if we can make this as easy as possible for people to understand, we've got a better chance of people actually doing the things they're supposed to do. You're very well saying you have to do this, if people don't understand it, don't give me a policy that's 30 pages and guidance knows it's 30 pages, because quite frankly, I'm not going to use anything I like to do. So it must be one of those relevant failures, and it must be in the public interest. And this is interesting. It must relate to something that has happened, is happening, or is likely to happen. Minority report, anybody? Is likely to happen. Do you think that poses, leading the witness, any challenges that likely to happen? I mean, it poses challenges, doesn't it? Like, that there are people that will make up stories about people because...
Quick thought, do you think that maybe that in some ways is a problem for whistleblowing? Because in the case of Lucy Letby, it's quite possible that HR said, oh, is it likely that a nurse here at the hospital is actually killing babies? It doesn't seem like a likely thing to happen. And so do we think that gives an opportunity for people to say, I don't think that's likely, that something that you might think is outside the realm of possibility?
I mean, it is bonkers, isn't it? That scenario is bonkers. If someone came to you and you said, I think this is happening, you'd be like, it's easy to sit back, and I don't know the details, and it does sound horrific, but if someone came to you in the first instance and said that, and you're the one that actually goes, oh, we've got to do something about this, that's challenging. But yes, it's absolutely, this isn't clear enough for people. It is likely to happen, just isn't clear enough for people. But if you've been in the toilet cubicle and you've overheard somebody saying that they were going to do something, can't think of an example now that you're not going to say you need to go to the police for. If you overhear something, and that's, you know, all of those things that we talked about, and in the public interest, then whether it's happened or not, under this current legislation, you can make the report, and even if it didn't happen, you would still be protected as a whistleblower because you thought it was likely to happen. There is no definition of what's in the public interest, which is super helpful. We just have to use a little bit of our own, as I said, cognitive process. It was raised in this case here, can't remember the details. And the court would set out 4 factors relevant to the public interest test. So the number of individuals whose interests the disclosure served. So if it's 1, perhaps not that interesting. If it's 10, if it's 20, if it's 100, but who are we to say that one baby was, you know, the nature of the wrongdoing? Again, not really helpful, is it? We've not got an explanation as to what wrongdoing is, but you know, the nature of wrongdoing might make it in the public interest. Nature of the interest affected, the extent to which they're affected, and the alleged identity of the wrongdoer. So we've got guidance as to what is interest, but we still don't have a clear black and white. This is the public interest. This isn't. The test depends on reasonable belief. If it's not, it is likely that there will be increased focus on whistleblower investigation on the workers' reasons for believing that disclosure was in the public interest based on those 4 factors. So I think this is a lot to get my mind around, and I've written policies for it. So when you think about who think about Heinz beans example, and it's spices, not poison, but who are going to be the people then that need to know this? Again, it's not a trick question. Who's the people likely? Is it likely to be your lawyers and your accountants and your office workers, or is it likely to be your food operators, your factory worker, machine operators? In this instance, with my Heinz baked beans, it's likely to be the lower end of the pay bracket that are having to understand this stuff. Now, what I'm not saying is lower end of the pay bracket doesn't have the brains. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is when we give them a policy that's 30 pages, these are people that are going to work to do their manual labour job. They're not going to want to sit down and read 30 pages. So going back to your point on governance and how we make sure that these processes are followed, that's why it's super duper important in the first instance that we're making this information as clear as possible. And we do that through training. So at Ocado, I did lots of different things. I had different training for the office workers, which is super nice to have robots that make you your lunch. It's very nice. And there is a difference between Ocado and Ocado Retail. Retail are the people that bring you your food. Ocado Group are the people that make the robots that pick your food. So Ocado Group is a listed company, not Ocado Retail, which is a food company. But still, I also did the same thing for Ocado Retail. So we had different ways of trying to educate the delivery drivers, and we had I mean, they probably didn't read them, but we had, what do you call them, those little stands that you have in the canteen, and we had like one small flyer with like 5 key bullet points on. We put a paragraph of text on there. This is when people still got hard copy pay slips. We did different ways of trying to get the information to them. You might often have seen, I saw it only this last week, posters on the back of toilet doors using infographics and a few key words rather than these 30 pages. So it's quite important when you're putting the processes in place behind whistleblowing to think about who your audience is, what language they're going to understand, what languages this information is in. And I've not even talked about like Braille and things like that, but you know, the people that you're trying to get the message to, and are you making this information inclusive and understood by everybody? I think I laboured that point, but does that make sense? Just kind of putting that governance into practice as well, and putting that, you know, what is governance? Well, it's this really. It's working with an internal comms person to make sure that we're using plain language and we're being consistent with our language. So I'm conscious of time. It is worth noting, you don't have to prove that the malpractice or the wrongdoing has happened. It's just that that's happened, like it's happened, it's happened, you have to prove it's happened to get protections. No statute of limitation on protected disclosures. And that's important. So it doesn't have to be while the person is employed. It can be after they've left employment. That's interesting from a governance perspective, because you find out that your HR department delete all employee records the minute that they leave the building on their last day. And if they've done that, and there is a subsequent whistleblowing report made, and the HR team has deleted all of their records, then that's going to hinder the investigation. So there's lots of other considerations. So when I talk about my internal stakeholders, my HR team is often an internal stakeholder. So it does not protect an employee who makes I shouldn't say worker, I should say employee, it's a different thing, who makes a disclosure purely out of self-interest and who does not believe their disclosure will be in the personal grievances, bullying, harassment, discrimination. They're not covered by whistleblowing, but I say that with hesitancy, because if it's the CEO of an organisation that's persistently, or a senior person, a person that's in it's a privileged position, is not quite right, but a person in a power, a person So normal everyday bullying, not covered, but if it's somebody that you would expect to be held at higher standard, or somebody that was perhaps dealing with vulnerable people, or there might be a specific reason why it would be included, but this all adds to my point that it's not black and white, and I'm hoping people aren't going to glaze over now because I've probably not made whistleblowing any clearer.
That'd be like the Formula One with Christian Horner.
Oh, was that Jerry Halliwell's?
Jerry Halliwell's
Yeah.
husband, and the leaking of, because that is sort of personal grievance, but then
Because of who he is.
because of who he is and the fact that they've then, and I don't know very much about it, but I think they've that person made a grievance, but then the way that the company's behaved makes it in the public
Yeah.
interest, perhaps.
Yeah, and you could say with Harvey Weinstein as well, and that lot of people, because of who they are, people go to them, and it is in the public interest because you wouldn't put yourself alone with them in a room if you knew those things, essentially. I'm just conscious of time. We talked a little bit about why somebody would be reluctant. So they might be fearful of their job security. They might be concerned about the reaction of their colleagues. They might be worried about the threat of intimidation and worried about victimisation. And again, we need to think about who we're actually talking about here, what background they are. It will be different in all these different cases. Actually, whilst we're at that point, and does anybody know, where is he? Oh, I've not written him down. Yes, I have. Johnny Mercer. Does anybody know about Johnny Mercer? It's the Thirlwell public inquiry. I think you would have seen it in the press. I'm excited because we're literally waiting. So he is the Veterans Minister. He's been ordered by a judge to name the Special Forces whistleblowers who raised concerns about the alleged executions of Afghans, or face jail if he refuses to comply. So you might have seen this in the press. The Veterans Minister has been ordered to hand over the names, or face prison, I just said that. The chairman of the Afghanistan inquiry, Sir Charles Haddon Cave, has given Plymouth MP Johnny Mercer until the 5th of April to provide a witness statement containing the names. The reason I'm excited is because I did try and find out whether he has, and all I could find was something he'd put on Instagram, I think yesterday, just saying it's important we remember, nothing about this, important we remember the work that our special veterans have done for us. So it was all a bit like code, and I wanted somebody here to tell me that they knew more details and whether he has or he hasn't, because I think that would be quite an interesting one academically. I mean, that's the epitome of what goes on tour stays on tour, right? I don't mean to be flippant. I don't mean to be flippant, but this is what's happening every day. There's so many examples, and you might not have necessarily seen that straight away and thought, oh, whistleblowing, but that's somebody that's a different angle to what we've been talking about today. And actually, he's trying to protect people. So he's not the whistleblower. There's been a whistleblower. There's now an inquiry, and he's refusing to help them with their inquiry for, I'm sure, very good reasons. But that layers different complexities in this situation. Well, watch out for it. We'll all be like, oh, that's interesting. But I just wonder whether his commitment to his colleagues will go so far as going to prison. Because that's quite a big ask, isn't it, from anybody? I expect you to go to prison. We'll see. We talked about that. We've talked about the post office. actually goes as far as allowing for compensation if people have suffered victimisation for whistleblowing. I haven't seen that in practice. I do have a friend who has some money in her bank because she blew the whistle, was subsequently victimised, and she got quite a big payout for it. I'm not suggesting anyone does it to pay off their student loans. Horrible situation for her. Didn't flip it again. It's a horrible situation. She doesn't want to have the money. But I don't know whether there's levels of compensation or whether it's done on a case-by-case basis, but it's worth remembering. You can, of course, claim unfair dismissal if you've been dismissed because of blowing the whistle. Again, I think the statutory payment for unfair dismissal is not very much. It probably wouldn't be an incentive to everybody. So in order to gain the protection, you have to demonstrate that you made this qualified disclosure, which goes with all those factors that we've talked about, that they followed the correct procedure, and that they were dismissed as a result of it. This stuff is boring. About earlier, that you are allowed to go to a legal advisor, a government minister, a prescribed person such as a regulator, or the media if you're not going to your organisation. You're allowed there. And we talked about a number of supports at the start. So I wanted to answer your question about the governance, and I hope I've kind of tried to weave that through. But given we've got like 15 minutes left, did anybody want to focus a bit more on the practical, or is there anything that we've talked about today that anybody wanted to drill down into a little bit more?
I have a question. I was wondering if it affects the employer's performance, right? Like job performance when it comes to whistleblowing. For example, let's say the manager is doing something that is affecting the worker's job performance. If, for example, I would go in and be a whistleblower, would that count, or would that still be considered personal?
I think that would be personal. Wouldn't be in the public interest necessarily, yeah. So would it be interesting at all if I talked through how I approached I haven't got any slides, but how I approached, for example, the Ocado whistleblowing? Yeah, so my perch. So when I went to Ocado, I've got no frame of reference. When you said I taught you in 2020, that blew my mind. So, but it was pre-COVID, and it was probably one of my first gigs when I set up by myself. So 5 or 6 years ago, they wanted their whistleblowing processes looked at. They were about to go to this external third-party anonymous platform provider, but there were lots of other things involved. So that was one of my projects with them. So the very first thing that I did was looked at what the existing policy that they had. So I looked at the policy and I checked that it was compliant with the law. And then I stripped it back and I made it into maybe 5 pages. I think it was like 20 before that. And I did a guidance section that went with that policy. And the reason I did that is because the guidance has to be really super clear on exactly what you must do in the event of whistleblowing. And I wanted the guidance to have a bit more fluidity about it. I wanted that to be able to be updated and amended as often as possible. And if I'd have left it all in the policy, then I would have had to have gone back to the
Legislation.
board. Yes, but also the board to approve it. And that would have slowed the process down. And I wanted to give them that fluidity and that freedom. So I looked at what they had already as a starting point, and then did a lot of analysis as to whether I thought it was fit for purpose. So there is no magic in what I do at all. Anyone can do what I do. I went out to the market and I had a look at a lot of other policies, and I used whatever means at my disposal for that, because a lot of companies aren't happy to put their policies and guidance in the public domain, but some of them are. So I would look at all sorts of organisations. I start with the peer company organisations, because that's, a FTSE 100 company versus a FTSE 100 company versus a large not-for-profit. There's no point looking in the not-for-profit if you're looking at a FTSE 100 company. So I'd look at the peer companies and I'd gather their processes. Then I talked to all of my internal stakeholders. So who owned the policy at that point? Was it COSEC or was it HR? was HR. Was she owning it appropriately? Was my second question. And how was the accountability? How did that lead up to the board? So we had lots of discussions. HR were completely on board. Lots of discussions with accountability. That referred to the introducing like the office of whistleblowing, where we looked at who on the board was accountable for whistleblowing and how did that filter down. So by identifying that line, that chain of command, then it actually got a bit more gravitas, because if it doesn't own it doesn't, if nobody that's senior owns it, no one's gonna look at it. So we looked at ownership, we looked at accountability. Then we looked at the ways of which we could make workers could make these disclosures, and they often use this anonymous platform. Lots of discussions had to be held there. There's a lot of other issues, data protection, for example. We had to look at avenues where people didn't have access to, most of us have smartphones, but a lot of people don't. So we had to make sure there was telephone calls. We had to think about all of our stakeholders across the whole business, from the drivers through to the office workers, and how they could make their reports. And then we looked at what I alluded to, which I think is super important, is the training. How do we make people aware? How do we make them aware as to what is whistleblowing and what is a whistleblowing report? How could we take that fear away from them? And that was a challenge. I don't know whether we've done it successfully, but we explored, as I said, lots of different ways of doing it. And we put it on the board's agenda. So boards, in my view, should have a cycle of agenda items. So every year there's so many items that they need to tick off and make sure that they've actually looked at as a board. And a good board, that's what they'll do. A lot of boards don't. But we added whistleblowing to the agenda twice a year. So twice a year, every single whistleblowing report was taken to the board. They don't have to have chapter and verse, they just have to have the number, the kind of nature, and the outcome. So as part of this whole process, we're looking at, yes, how can your workers make the disclosures and what they all are, but then the other side, apart from accountability, which is up there, is the investigation afterwards. So we really drill down into how they were investigated, but it all comes back up to accountability at Ocado anyway. So we'd make that would be how we're making sure that something was investigated and then it didn't just end. Our processes went right back to, sometimes you can go back to whistleblower and say, we've done X, Y, and Z because of what you said, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes you cannot tell them. There's other reasons why you cannot tell them what you've done. You've just got to be able to say enough to them, say, we've taken you seriously and you're just going to have to trust us, or some other wording. And I think it will soon be obvious to that person whether something's been done or it hasn't been done. So it was a huge project because, as I alluded to as well, it's UK, but it's also international. So we had to engage quite a lot of external lawyers so that we could break down exactly what the rules were in all of the different jurisdictions that Ocado operated in. I mean, in the last couple of years, they've branched out to so many other international jurisdictions that I'm only hoping that every time they go into a different jurisdiction that they find out what the laws are relevant to whistleblowing in that jurisdiction and add that to the framework that we put together, the flow chart that we put together. So, the Public Interest Disclosure Act, there's only like 4 lines or something that I read to you that really are relevant, but you can see there's kind of months of work involved in that. Translating the training, the company secretary did a video as well that was played in all of the public spaces. So there's a lot of people, the internal stakeholders that are involved, from, as I said, HR, legal, internal comms, COSEC, but the amount of people that are you an investigator? They need to get training in how to investigate properly. We need to have that out of hours triggered. How do we know that something's going to be dealt with out of hours? So from a very small requirement, there's so much work that's done behind it, and that has to keep being done annually to make sure it's still fresh and it's still relevant. So that's that really. Any questions? Any questions online?
There's none at the moment, but keeping an eye on them. A quick question. And none of the legislation seems to have anything about the requirement of what boards must do. Because I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I was just thinking about what you just said about the post office, about Ocado having twice a year.
Yeah.
How many whistleblowing reports have there been? What have been the outcome? Thinking, do we think that if the board had heard that there have been 47 reports in the last 6 months from people saying that they question the reliability of the Fujitsu computer system, so do we think that there's a requirement for?
Yes, so what we do have in the Corporate Governance Code 2018, that introduced this line which says something like, it's under the board's responsibility, and it's something about workers having the right to make an anonymous something. It doesn't say whistleblowing, it doesn't say speak up, but it says something that's nuanced, but it specifically workers and anonymous reports onto the board's remit. So, but that's, the Corporate Governance Code is only for listed companies, but other organisations have their own governance codes, which generally reflects, but governance is comply or explain, so you don't have to do it. But I'm trying to think whether it, which I should have known, whether it's in the large private charity governance code or Waite's principles. And if it's not, it should be. So it's not in the law yet, and I think you're absolutely right. And the reason at the start of this, when I kind of hesitated a bit about sustainability in the boards, and that's, I think we could talk forever about that, and whether, does whistleblowing come under the sustainability? I haven't mentioned sustainability as a department, but lots of organisations have sustainability departments now, and they are growing, and the one at Ocado is fab. I also wrote the modern slavery department with the I wrote the modern slavery statement with the sustainability department at Ocado, some fabulous people in it. Would I put whistleblowing under sustainability? Probably, I probably wouldn't, but that's not to say that other companies wouldn't put it there. More, I think whistleblowing still comes, it's my honest view, as much as I've made it very exciting, it still comes under those boring compliance policies that a lot of boards aren't really interested in until they get burnt, which is most things really, until it becomes an issue. Modern slavery, I was the deputy co-secretary next, and does anybody remember when there was something in the press, would have been about 7 years ago, where John Lewis and Next were getting their mattresses from a factory that had employed modern slaves. I don't think that's the right. Don't think you're employing. Yeah, that used, and they escaped to a car park. Now, Next was absolutely exonerated from any wrongdoing at that time, because they put. I mean, they had 42 people that worked in their supply chain audit team. You know, they went over and above to make sure they had all the processes they possibly could to make sure that there was no modern slavery in their supply chain. But this gang was so sophisticated, it was an absolute industry, that they just fooled so many people. But yes, I was. Sorry, roundabout way, just going back to whether whistleblowing would sit with sustainability, and at the moment I can't think of any examples where it would, but that's not to say it won't at some point. Any questions?
It's more of a statement, because obviously the NHS has its governance code, which has to report on every year, and Freedom to Speak Up has been on the board agenda twice a year for a number of years, and so the Countess of Chester Hospital would have been getting those Freedom to Speak Up reports and made zero difference. And probably, you know, if you think back to Suffolk and Sussex and now Notts, again, I suppose that sort of critical thinking, what difference has it made?
Yeah, but I mean, I'd be questioning the quality of the reports. I don't know what's gone to the board. Was it a number? Was it a number and a line? Was there somebody? And I don't know anything about NHS, and I think governance structure must be super complicated. But you're questioning the quality that's gone to them, the quality of the investigation is we strip it all the way back. That they might do that thing that they say they're doing, but if everything else has failed, it's got to the point. I sit in board meetings, I'm sure you do, and you hear. In fact, I was in a governors meeting the other day, and they were talking about bullying in the school. Now, my son has been bullied from the school, so I was straight away, my heckles were up, and I was like really interested in what they were saying. And then he said there were no instances of bullying, and I was furious. I was literally furious. But whilst my son has been threatened to have his legs broken, if you look at the definition of what bullying is, he wasn't told that enough times. He was only told it 3 times, not 4 times. Again, I'm being flippant, but it's sometimes when you go to a board, if you're only hearing the black and white and you're not getting the picture behind it, and as much as I was so super annoyed in that meeting, nothing that was said was wrong, but it was very, very black and white and didn't kind of give any colour. So I would be questioning the processes that go to that. And are you, as a director, your section 171 to 177 duties, are you fulfilling your own duties by just seeing a line on a report that says there's been 7 and we've dealt with them all? I'd be questioning that. I think there's so many things that must have gone wrong. Thank you, guys.
Someone else have a question? Did I see another hand go up?
Yeah, can I ask? This is about Freedom of Information Act. I don't really know about the Freedom of Information Act, but if someone wanted to request, because whistleblowing is potentially in the public interest, and the Freedom of Information Act might be connected to the public interest, could someone, without malicious reasons, just ask for occurrences, ask a company how many whistleblowing.
Not a company, because freedom of information.
Okay.
I don't know
Services.
Freedom of information is public sector, isn't it? Public. So you couldn't ask a company.
Okay.
You can only ask company data protection. So if you believed that the company had some information on you personally. You could go to, and I think this is how a lot of journalists make their news. The journalists would go to the NHS and say, I believe they could, but don't quote me, but they could go to the NHS and say, under the Freedom of Information Act, tell me, but it has to be very specific. You can't just say, can you go away and look into this information for me and then give it back to me? It's got to be a document that exists. Or
can you tell me, I was going to say, can someone ask how many whistleblowing, under your whistleblowing policy, how many reports have been given to you this year and how many have been fully investigated, and what were the numbers?
No, because you're asking them to do a piece of work for you.
Right.
I think you could say, I'll come to you in a second, I think you could say, under the Freedom of Information Act, how many whistleblowing reports have been made during the year, and that would be our document. And then if you had another document that said how many have been investigated, what?
So, because the team sits under me, so I'll just.
There we go.
So if you're a public body, local authority, NHS, anything that's funded by public money, that's where the FOI kicks in. So you can ask anything as long as it's going to take under 18 hours to get that information to you. So if it goes,
18, that's quite a lot.
It's a hell of a lot. It's a full-time industry. Most public companies have to employ people to answer FOIs. So there's various websites called Working For Us, Daily Mail, etc., that literally will just send those through. So most organisations of our size, for instance, we probably get 60 or 70 queries a month, and you have to answer it within 21 days. And so there's all sorts of time frames, and that's where the Information Commissioner's Officer comes in.
So it's different to data protection. So it's not something that exists already. You can be requested to go away and put the information together
In a format of their choice. So, for instance, they could say how many. They can't ask specific things about individual people, but they can ask if we hold that data they can ask for it and we give it to them in the format that they want. Mostly it's Excel spreadsheets. So they could say, how many referrals did you have into your organisation for people that lived in Gainsborough? As long as it's more than 5, you can give them that information. How many people, you know, and actually how many whistleblowing tests, how many allegations of sexual harassment, that's a big one in the, you know, and all of the transgender services have been inundated with Freedom of Information Acts because obviously the press are interested, and that kind of gives a flavour of what's going to be coming up in the news, what's coming up in our FOI teams beforehand. It is a big thing. But if you say it's going to go more than 18 hours, I'm talking really quickly because I can see the time, then you have to give a reason why it's going to take more than 18 hours and give a cost to what it's going. So they could still come back and go, it's going to take more than 18 hours and we're quite happy to pay that, but we still want the information.
Is there a limit to how much you can charge per hour?
It has to be reasonable. So if we're saying we've got an FOI on 30 grand a year, we have to make that cost applicable to 30 grand a year's time worth, if that makes sense.
Every day's a school day.
There's 42 exemptions or just over, so you can, you know, sort of say you can't have that information because it's, but there's very little that you can use. Commercially is sensitive, you can't actually use them as a public sector unless you're just about to go out to procurement or tender or something like that.
So that's for, freedom of information is for those that use public money.
Yes.
Yeah. You couldn't go to our company unless it was you and your personal data.
Sorry. Just go on.
Great, thank you everybody. It's been lovely to speak to you again.
Thank you.